welcome everyone. My name is Leslie Townsend. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Historic New Harmony, and I want to thank everyone for coming out both last night and today for this wonderful speaker series. And I'm really honored to present our provost at the University of Southern Indiana, Dr. Mohammed Qayyum. He's going to say a few words.
Making the trip was worth it. So thank you. This is good timing. I tend to go over my time, and so putting me in the middle here before the panelists was great. So I was asked to make some remarks, closing remarks, and every time you have to do something like this, you have some decisions to make. What do you want to say, and what's the sequence? So I had two options. One was to show some effort to learn something about architecture so I could have some relevance, but the other was to say something about the importance of New Harmony to USI, the University of Southern Indiana. And the decision about which one to use depended a lot on what was said prior to me having to make these remarks. And so after listening, not to everybody, but to at least two presenters, I think I will go with saying something about the importance of New Harmony to USI. And then say a little bit about something about architecture that I think might have some value. When we were founded, I believe that one of the best things that could have happened to the university was to build a bond with New Harmony. Much time has passed. That bond, I believe, is firm, it's durable, but there's some work that needs to be done. And the nature of that work depends on the kind of ideas and the relationships that have been built over centuries so that we continue to do in events such as these. But the way in which that bond has to continue to be strengthened, I think, is connected to my second theme in architecture. So I've written a book, produced and printed in 2006, and it talked about an architect who had a great interest in nature. And he used his insights from nature to design a building. But this was his beginning with regard to that particular structure. It had to do with termites. And it had to do with the way termites survived and functioned in Africa. And so I'm going to quote a little bit from the book because I can remember every single thing here. Termites must keep the internal temperature in their mounds at a constant 87 degrees in order to grow an essential fungus. Not easy in some parts of the world, such as the African plains, where temperatures can range from over 100 degrees during the day to below 40 degrees at night. These insects, however, manage to do so by ingeniously directing breezes at the base of the mound into chambers with cool wet mud, and then redirecting this cool air to the peak of the mound. By constantly building new vents and closing old ones, they can regulate temperature precisely. The architect, with engineers, designed a structure in 1996 in Zimbabwe, which allowed for temperatures to range between 73 and 77 degrees with no air conditioning plant. Comparable structures to this building in terms of size use much more energy than this particular structure. And the way they were able to do it was more or less along the lines of how the termites kept their mound cool. The purpose of this particular illustration, however, had to do with something different than what I just described. And it was the idea of stepping into the intersection. So the book had this notion that innovation in the world occurs at intersections. And intersections would involve anything like intersection of cultures, fields, disciplines, people's life experiences, etc., etc. And out of those intersections would be a proliferation of ideas. And they would happen in volume, exponentially, but also in speed. And so I want to use that as the starting point of a conversation about the future of the relationship between the university and New Harmony, because it is an intersection. And that intersection allows us to think of New Harmony the way we think of the internet. The internet is a platform. It brings together diverse elements through some norms. And out of those norms, it builds relationships that are very complicated, but also allow for adaptability. And out of that adaptability, there is value. So if you think of New Harmony as a platform, it allows us, through events such as these, to build networks. Columbus, New Harmony. Networks that arise because of individuals who are interactive, having intersectional kinds of conversations. So New Harmony allows those networks for the University of Southern Indiana to expand beyond what we can do by ourselves. As a platform, there are complex relationships, as we have with the internet. Tough things that happen with relationships. And they're complex, and therefore they need to be worked on to get to solutions for the outcomes that are all, or in the interest of all. So there are these complex relationships, but there are networks that we could take advantage of. New Harmony has shown over centuries that it's adaptive. We can learn at the university about that particular resiliency and adaptive capability. And right now, not just the University of Southern Indiana, but many universities across the nation are at a point of crisis with regard to their future, both in terms of society recognizing the value that they bring, as well as their financial sustainability at a more bottom line, in a more bottom line sense. We also have the ability with New Harmony to talk about the unique value. So for the University of Southern Indiana, in this period where there's a lot of questions about what is the value of higher education in society, and how would that be in the future compared to where it is today, given all the changes with the ecosystem around knowledge. For a long time, universities were the centers of control, of knowledge and information. We were the gatekeepers. The internet, technology has now made that control disappear. In the classroom, on a device, a student can get more current information than a professor can provide on a particular topic at a point in time. Control of knowledge is no longer in our space. Therefore, we have to reimagine what we mean to society, given that we still believe that we have a role to play in the knowledge ecosystem. So, New Harmony is a differentiator for us in this new world, because it is unique. And there are very few universities that can claim that they have a relationship with a historical, multi-generational experiment, as one of the presenters spoke about, in a way that they can bring to themselves the attention, the learning, the experiences, and value. And so I believe as we go forward, the University of Southern Indiana needs to look at this relationship in a way and learn from it, so that we can become more adaptive, we can benefit from the networks, and we can use the unique value of New Harmony as a differentiator for our institution as we seek to position ourselves for continued success and survival over the next 100 years. So, thank you.
I'm on the faculty and former dean of another university, but I can only say that for people in here to hear your words of support, I think are very happy, as you can see. At this point, we are going to have a quick wrap up because we have wine and cheese downstairs and books to be signed and sold. And so we know that it's been a kind of an extensive afternoon. So I propose a quick wrap up, 20 minutes. All the authors, all the speakers will come up. Erin will be the center of gravity, and we can take it from there. Come on up.
Very imposing sitting behind this table. So of course I missed the events yesterday, which is really too bad. But where to begin? How should we wrap this up? I thought maybe we should start with the two first presenters. Maybe start with Carla, because you presented before any of us presented. And I would be especially interested to hear, given your historical knowledge about what I was calling the Third New Harmony, as well as your own experience with working in a community that's very different than the norm in the United States. What we might expect, or what we might dream of, based on this layered history. And my second question that occurred to me, you showed the generational handoff. Right. And of course, one of the issues we have here is that there was a break in that generational handoff. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, first of all, on what that means for its current condition, and building on what Ben Nicholson was saying, how we might prepare for a more productive generational handoff. Is that enough?
Yeah. Well, clearly, I was interested in this idea of the longue durée, looking at the long duration of societal patterns. And it occurred to me that New Harmony very much represents a series of ideas that are, even in spite of the breaks, are carried on through to the present. And it seems to me that this idea of New Harmony as a place of hope, a resource of hope, is through this idealism of this long duration. So one doesn't want to parse it too carefully, but really focus on those long patterns of meaning and value that can be carried through time to the present. And I think going forward, one of the ideas that I keep returning to because of my new teaching and this center of the Navajo Nation, I'm very much drawn to this idea, to the ideas of critical regionalism, to trying to understand the relationship between a global or universal culture and the meaning and particularity of a place. And that is something that I feel that I have to negotiate constantly within my experience living in and amongst the Navajo people. And I do think that there's something to be revisited for the people here in New Harmony. How can you participate within a larger global community and yet at the same time maintain your rootedness in what makes this place completely unique? And I think that discussion has to be constantly addressed and renegotiated. So that's a very long-winded response.
That's great.
But,
if I can follow up maybe with Sylvia, this sense that there is a content to this place that was spiritual in various guises all the way through its last iteration. I'm wondering where that went. I'm also wondering where the Harmonist millions went. Since they all died out, what happened to all those millions? Where are they, is that where they went?
They went to Florida with 20, I think it was 27 train wagons were filled, loaded with valuables. And they also, one of them bought the Ringling in Barnum Circus.
Wow, okay.
So they looked for ways to spend the millions.
Maybe they were buried here somewhere. No, but to get serious, so there was a religious, and what's interesting in your talk is you talked so eruditely about their entrepreneurial activities and how they tied into that American tradition of tinkering and invention. You talked about being German, but of course it's also very, very American. But I would love to hear a little bit more about what was the actual spiritual aspect that led them to denounce, to become celibate, that led them to move on from New Harmony. What is it that is at the kernel of that religious experience? It's important to me because it seems like when we talk about the Harmonists, when we talk about Owen and his ideals, we tend to forget about the ideals. We talk about the structure. We tend to talk about, and even Provost gave a beautiful, very eloquent speech, but it talks, if you'll forgive me, about the transactional value that New Harmony has, hinted at the effect that would have on higher education. But I wonder, and even in Ben Nicholson's talk, if you're trying to preserve this building as a work of art, if it is a Mona Lisa that we shouldn't put lipstick on, what is the spiritual value? What is that something that we should preserve? What is that something that lies here? My favorite version of this is, of course, it's all about the earth lines, because the earth lines here are, anyone else would disagree? It's like Sedona.
It's a
Earth-
vortex.
Well, the earth lines, the negative ionization is very high here, so it's a very good place to be. So, what is that? That was a much longer question, sorry.
No, I don't know if I can 100% answer this, but I will try. I think the Harmonists, when they left Germany, it was a time of tremendous chaos in Europe. And the notion of being heard, because they didn't have a voice in Württemberg at the time. However, they never called themselves being persecuted, religiously persecuted, because they knew they rebelled against the government. They knew they didn't follow the law by not paying taxes, by not joining the military, by not having their children baptized, by not sending their children to school, even though there was mandatory schooling. What they wanted to have is a voice, I think, and also experience some peace. Peace away from war, and that combination, perhaps with the underlying wish to also pursue more economic advantages, was a founding, or it was the impetus, I think. And as you,
But what did they believe in? Or
they believed in the second coming of Christ. They believed in a world that would be regulated, or heaven on earth, that would be where they wouldn't have to make decisions, where their decision would be reflected.
but they thought of themselves as the chosen who were
Right.
building the building blocks for this, were preparing the way, were
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right.
And what their harmony here, harmony,
Right.
that they built a worldly harmony that would only be in the end a permanency, a 1,000-year empire.
Aaron, this question of the spiritual nature of the town, it's always with us. People are always asking us, and so it would be expected that you would do so. I can't win with this guy. But the way that I've heard it put the best is that ground, if people go to ground a lot with a sense of well-being, it feels better than not. In other words, that sense of community that we're all grasping after, it actually has a physical sense.
Yes.
You certainly have to believe it, but we have so many times have had visitors who either speak of the ions being aligned nicely, or that it's the thin place between heaven and earth. But the other thing is that because there is music in this town, literally, when you go to a place where you've heard an incredible piece of music or listened to something quite extraordinary being discussed, when you go back to that place, you hear those voices and that music all over again. So that there is we like to call it a fund being built up in this town that is impossible to give value to scientifically. You certainly can't talk about it in universities because you just get run out of town and sent to crazy land. But beyond that, I'd be repeating myself.
Let's be a little bit more, I have a hidden agenda here, which is to get it away from the kind of nebulousness. That's why I was trying to get something about harmony to get to that point.
Yeah.
And I was hoping you would talk about Meyer claimed to use the golden proportion, but he's also made greater claims for the abstraction of his art. And I also want to go back to that first discussion about community and really take it, because you were also talking about J. Berwin Miller, who, let's not forget, at one point was seen as not just a major political, intellectual and industrial leader, but also as a potential president, touted as such on the cover of Time magazine. There seems to be, both here and there, this notion that there is a very practical way to build a better world, that there is a practical way to address this notion of spirituality. The roof has to be absent, but the walls can be built, so to speak, and those walls can bring people together. Peter and I were noticing the buildings that were collected here were buildings that articulate connection and craft and enclosure, choice out of a lot of other kind of buildings. Could there be some model in this very concrete notion that Columbus had, not just to make pretty buildings, but to build community, and that you're trying to carry forward as well?
Maybe. I think that the most important thing that leaders do today is set a culture. And you see this in a political or business or whatever level, is that they define the traditions and values of whatever thing they're representing. And in Harmony, you had extraordinary 19th century leaders in the two utopias, and then you had an extraordinary leader in the 20th century. In Columbus, it's a similar story minus the utopia. You had, in Erwin Miller, but it gets overshadowed a little bit because there was a number of corporations that were what I would call enlightened business leaders. They understood what was good for their corporation was good for the community. And I think that for as much as there is something in this fund or this bank, there is an endowment here, right? That you all are like responsible for stewarding and managing, but you have to keep, it'll go away.
Yes.
And so it's the same thing in Columbus, is that it'll go away. And so like the idea of trying to encourage leaders or to represent or to identify things when leadership is good, to set the traditions and values and to try to move them forward. And if you hit it at a time when somebody actually has coins in their pocket, that's when change happens.
So I remember through our conversation about Columbus, there was the so-called Columbus way, right? Sort of an attitude towards doing things, but I think it's not dissimilar here, where you had a very charismatic figure, J. Erwin Miller and Jane Blaffer Owen. They leave the world, and then who takes up the same or a similar or different type of attitude towards community? I will say, if I may end this conversation, Okay, does this work? Let me I'll end this conversation with a bit of a kind of provocation. I think that the single most important building site that incorporates the essence of this town is not this building in which we're gathered here, the Athenaeum, but it's in fact the Roofless Church, which was the first major site that Jane Blaffer Owen commissioned. And in that site, you have the most radical provocation to a kind of secular society. You have a roofless church, perimeter walls, grass. You have a sacred space, but that's open to the world. You have a Jew building a sculpture. You have an anti-Semitic, possibly, building the architecture. You have
in fact, a card-carrying Nazi.
Yeah, but and then you have Jane Blaffer Owen's homage to Père Alain Couturier, embedded into the wall. And Couturier, as we know, if you don't, was the great Dominican priest who opened up the Catholic Church in the post-World War II years to hiring architects that weren't believers. Couturier was the first to give commissions to Le Corbusier, for Ronchamp, and he argued that in fact you didn't have to be a believer to do inspiring architecture, religious architecture. And so I think Roofless Church captures the greatest sort of sense of this place where shingles coexist with Baroque forms, and there is also a unique window into Jane Blaffer Owen's amazing sensitivity, understanding of the natural qualities. And you're heading to school where the former leader was inspired by Walt Whitman and nature. I mean, Jane was very much inspired by nature, and that's part of the essence of this place, and the spiritual part. And I think the relationship with nature and the Roofless Church that forces you to look up and into the fields through the careful framing of the loggia is possibly the most poignant, testament to this place. Now, Meyer, this is amazing.
Michelangelo, I appreciate your stance, and regarding typologies, a church has a responsibility to do that. I think what New Harmonies has, which other towns do not have, is one or two buildings that represent one or two ways of looking at the world. And as Meyer so correctly drew out, there's a procession of those buildings, each of which has a different responsibility. You could double down on the Roofless Church and go for the gold, which is to stand in the absolute vacancy of the graveyard, which is a brick square. And for the hardcore, that's the place. Where there are, generations of people buried. Minimalism, boy, forget about minimalism. Go to that graveyard, and there you'll see it. And I think that all of the buildings in the town reciprocally help each other out gain this place. This is the proper layer. We know that. It's not the Athenaeum, it's the entrance to the town. And I think that the notion of spirituality is, much like the Greek Acropolis, a collection of buildings, none of which can survive by itself.
Well put. I think, Ben, on this note, we should perhaps,
Get spiritual with some wine.
yeah.
Continue the conversation. Very good.
Thank you all.
Very good.
If I could, I want to just let you know that we now have a wine and cheese in the atrium, and I need to say a very special thank you to Hafer, who sponsored our speaker series last night and tonight, so huge thanks to them.